Please join in a moment of centering silence so we can be fully present with each other this morning. And now let's get musically present with each other by turning to the words for our ingathering hymn, which you'll find inside your order of service. And we will begin anew today by saying welcome to another wonderful Sunday here at FUS Unitarian Society, where independent thinkers gather in a safe, nurturing, and welcoming environment to explore issues of social, spiritual, and ethical significance as we try to make a difference in this world. I'm Steve Goldberg, a proud member of this congregation, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to any guests, visitors, or newcomers. If this is your first time at FUS Unitarian Society, I know you'll find that this is a special place. If you'd like to learn more about our special buildings, we'll be conducting a guided tour after today's service. Just gather over here by the windows after the service, and we will take good care of you. Speaking of taking care of each other, this would be a perfect time to silence those pesky electronic devices that you just will not need for the next hour. And that goes for those of you watching at home. And if you're accompanied by a youngster today, and you think that young person would rather experience the service from a more private space, we offer a couple alternatives, including our child haven at the back of the auditorium, and some comfortable seating just outside the doorway in the commons from which you can see and hear the service. And the reason you can see and hear the service is because we have a great team of volunteers who provide that kind of support every weekend for the service. I'd like to read their names to you right now. Handling the sound system is David Bryles. Thank you, David. Our lay minister is Tom Boykoff. Thank you, Tom. Claire Box has been our greeter upstairs. Thank you, Claire. Our ushers are Marty Hollis and Nancy Daly. The coffee hour is hosted by Nancy Kossoff. John Hughes has made sure that the greenery up here is vibrant. And our tour guide after the service is Michelle Masson. Two announcements. One, a reminder that after the 11 o'clock service, around 12:30, we'll be holding a very important and exciting parish meeting right in this space, to be preceded by a wonderful buffet luncheon. So please come back for that. And the last announcement is 16. It has been 16 days since Cabaret. So with that, I invite you to sit back or lean forward to enjoy this morning's service. I know you will find that it will touch your heart, stir your spirit, and trigger one or two new thoughts. We're glad you're here.
Come into this place of peace and let its ambience heal your spirit. Come into this place of memory and let its history inspire your soul. Come into this place of prophecy and of power and let its vision lift your hearts. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit for the lighting of our chalice. Please join me in repeating the words of affirmation printed in the program. Over time, we come to treasure and to trust a spiritual community, the traditions, the history, and especially the people who share it with us. With and through these people, young and old, familiar and unfamiliar, we reach out, backward into history, forward into the future, to weave the generations of this congregation into a seamless garment of memory and of hope. And now I invite you on this fine June morning to turn to your neighbor and exchange with them a warm greeting. Please be seated. children who are with us today to depart for summer fun, if that is their preference. Continue with this selection by my colleague Victoria Safford, who serves our congregation at White Bear Lake in Minnesota. A child I know, when asked recently whether she would answer the call of her elementary school principal to wear red, white, and blue clothes to school on Thursday, this child that I know was in a quandary. She put down the crayon with which she was painstakingly trying to squeeze the words, "Peace is possible," onto the white bars between the red bars on her small American flag. And she said, "Well, it's a pretty good country, but it's hard to know what to wear." This is a pretty good country. It is one of hundreds and hundreds of pretty good countries layered relatively recently onto the skim of topsoil or desert sand or water that covers our globe. It is one of hundreds of pretty good countries filled with millions of pretty good and proud and worthy people, these other lands with sunlight and clover too. It's a pretty good but also a pretty complicated country where lately I, a lifelong citizen, feel even more than usual like an alien, afraid that if I speak, my voice might betray not some foreign place of origin, but the uneven geography of my heart. It is hard to know what to wear. And what to say. These days, everywhere I go, with everyone I meet, I'm wondering, where are you coming from, friend? With your black armband, with your flag, with your tears? What roads have you traveled to reach the place where you are now? In our pretty good country, it's an honor and a privilege to answer and in turn to ask, what really are you loyal to? What usefulness can nationalism serve now as the old world yields to a new century? What is America's right relation and right role and my right role as a citizen? And what are you going to wear? The child found her own remarkable response. When asked what it is she would like to do, she did say, well, it's a pretty good country. And she looked up then for confirmation of that claim, for some reassurance that this guess might in fact be true, and this I gladly gave to her. She knows that I have my doubts, but needs to be reminded just as I do that they go hand in hand, those doubts, with the hopes and the dreams that are so passionate and so powerful. And then the child said, deeply serious, without seeking any collaboration or any permission, I think I'm going to wear turquoise, pink, and beige for now. And so she did. And I don't know if she knows what risk might be entailed there, what wrath she might incur among her playground comrades or her teachers or her principal, or how her own chosen symbols of ambivalence might be understood or misunderstood. I don't know what confidence she might inspire in this country to which she has not even yet learned at her young age to pledge allegiance. For now, she will be a turquoise patriot. She's proud and scared and questioning. Her allegiance, however, is to her own conscience. And her trust is, for now, with the adults in whose clumsy hands her entire future is contained. I invite you to rise once more in body or in spirit as we sing together hymn number 83. Please be seated. As America's Memorial Day weekend approached, Barack Obama participated in a solemn commemorative ceremony in Hiroshima, Japan. 71 years ago, on a bright, cloudless morning, he said, "Death fell from the sky, and the world was changed." The visit was considered noteworthy because Obama became the first U.S. president to visit this historic site while still holding office. And in his remarks, Obama expressed sincere regret over the use of nuclear weapons against cities that were packed with civilians. But he also refrained from issuing an outright apology. Indeed, he explicitly addressed Japan's own culpability, telling his audience that their country was to blame for the Pacific War. The leaders of your advanced nation succumbed, he said, to the same base instincts for domination that had caused conflicts among the simplest of tribes. Still, the president lifted up Hiroshima as an object lesson in the dangers posed yet today by nuclear weapons. We have to have the logic to escape the fear and pursue a world without these weapons, he admonished. Now, unfortunately, nations as well as individuals typically suffer from selective memory. At the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, one would search in vain for any mention of Pearl Harbor, of the many atrocities committed by the Japanese during their occupation of China, of the high death toll among U.S. and Filipino prisoners of war. And for his part, Mr. Obama neglected to mention that more than 300,000 Japanese civilians were killed in saturation bombing missions of a more conventional nature. and that during the last phase of World War II, U.S. strategists adopted a scorched earth policy. The entire population of Japan is a proper military target. An intelligence officer for the 5th Air Force declared there are no civilians in Japan. This policy led, in the words of U.S. General Bonner Fellers, it led to the most ruthless and barbaric killing of non-combatants in all history. Mark Twain's pithy observation that a clear conscience is a sure sign of a bad memory would not seem out of order in either country's case. Now, because most of us are emotionally and ideologically attached to the tribe or the nation we belong to, our memories do often suffer from some pretty severe editing. In our hearts, we want our country to be more than pretty good. We want it to be better and more righteous than all the rest, and so we simply banish the ugly stuff. You know, many of the texts written for elementary and high school history students contribute to, rather than mitigate, this natural tendency, this editing tendency that we possess. These books are often muddled by the conflicting desire to promote inquiry on the one hand and to indoctrinate blind patriotism on the other, James Lowen writes in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. History, he says, is the only field in which the more courses a high school student takes, the stupider he or she is likely to become. Now, some children, like the one that Victoria Safford described in that reading I shared earlier, some children remain skeptical of the whole red, white, and blue curriculum imposed on them in the classroom. Parental guidance or outside sources of information may have influenced their thinking, but regrettably, this willingness to explore other color schemes, that is hardly the norm. But is not the process of sanitizing or idealizing a nation's past, is that not similar to the behavior that many of us exhibit in the private sphere? How many of us feel secure enough to resurrect and to relive those episodes in our own personal history in which we failed to uphold our professed values? We all want to think well of ourselves. We all have the desire to protect our fragile egos. And so we consign those insalubrious memories to the closet. And the history we do recall, Sam Keane writes, tends to be propaganda that preserves the status quo of our personal identity. I don't think people do this intentionally. In many cases, it represents an automatic self-protective reflex. But although they may be hidden away in the dark reaches of that deep closet, those memories don't simply disappear. Sigmund Freud wrote extensively on the subject of repression, and one of his more original theories had to do with the return of the repressed. If we cannot entertain, process, and resolve an event, a memory, consciously, that memory will follow an indirect, circuitous path and return to bite us, producing emotional and/or physical symptoms. Now, many of the ideas that Freud developed have been discredited, are no longer in vogue, but repression and its potentially deleterious effects, that particular idea ought to be taken seriously. Nelson Mandela certainly thought so. And with the end of apartheid, and with his elevation to the South African presidency, Mandela did a remarkable thing. He established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, Mandela assured anxious white South Africans that there would be no reprisals. There would be no abrupt turning of the tables after decades of harsh repression on the part of the white minority. But he also insisted that it would be dead wrong to simply forgive and forget everything that had happened in the past. So instead, he empowered a commission, and for many months, its members interviewed both the victims and the perpetrators of apartheid brutality. There would be no repression of those unpleasant memories. Now, South Africa today remains a troubled state, with levels of racial inequity, crime, violence commensurate with our own. But the country did not dissolve into chaos, at least in part because its citizens came clean about their history. Perpetrators who admitted to their crimes, ultimately they were granted amnesty, which troubled some black people. But then, as Chris Hedges explains, dignity, identity, and memory were restored. And for many of the affected families, this was enough. Restorative justice, which is gaining wider acceptance in our own country, it operates along similar lines. Here, a meeting between the victims and the perpetrators of crimes is arranged. And the two parties share their stories, and then they explain how this particular crime had affected them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And this straightforward accounting of past events, that paves the way for accountability, for emotional healing, and ultimately for making amends. But it all begins with remembering. Because as Wendell Berry remarks, in memory lies the salvation of the world, a world of true charm and diversity and health. But this remembering might not be quite as simple as it sounds, because the human memory is fallible, and thus it is often rather undependable. Recent studies out of Northwestern University are, in this respect, hardly reassuring. Recall, these researchers say, operates in much the same way as the telephone game. We know how the telephone game works. A piece of information is passed along from individual to individual, each of whom tries to convey it accurately to the next party. Nevertheless, the message differs ever so slightly with each retelling, so that by the time it reaches the last party, it hardly resembles the original message. Recall works in much the same way. Each time we retrieve an event from our memory banks, our brain reworks it a little bit, and then a little more, and then a little more. And the further we move away from that event in time, the greater the divergence between the original details and the ones that our active imaginations have manufactured. The central event, that will remain pretty much intact, but the furnishings around it will all have been rearranged. A study out of Emory University produces important corroborating evidence. Here, a class of psychology students were given a worksheet, and they were asked to fill in the details of where they were and what they were doing when the Challenger space shuttle blew up 2 years earlier. Now, these students expressed a very high level of confidence in the accuracy of their memories, but that was hardly reflected in their scores, which averaged 3 on a scale of 7. A quarter of the students scored 0. Their memories, the researchers say, were vivid, clear, and more often than not, dead wrong. This is a finding that we might do well to consider the next time we get into an argument with family members or friends over a past event. Generally speaking, people don't willfully distort the past. Blame the gray matter upstairs. Our brains are not programmed like Google to download all the details on demand. The real problem is that we tend to be overly confident about our powers of recall, and this ends up making us cocksure and self-righteous. Our relationships would undoubtedly be better served and a lot of needless arguments avoided if, in matters of memory and when nothing is to be gained, we simply agree to disagree. As evidence mounts, confirming the fickleness of memory, the courts are also taking notice. Eyewitness testimony, once thought to be the gold standard in terms of evidence, eyewitness testimony is now being seriously reevaluated. A study committee of the National Academy of Sciences recommends giving much less weight to such testimony. It is moving from something that we thought was unshakable, the commission said, to something that is far less valuable to a case. That our minds really aren't up to the task of accurate retention, that was already pretty self-evident to the psychologist and philosopher William James a century ago. Selection, he said, is the very keel upon which our mental ship is built. If we remembered everything, he said, we should be just as ill off as if we remembered everything. It would take as long for us to recall a space of time as it took for the original time to elapse. We would never get ahead in our thinking. All recollected times undergo foreshortening. And this foreshortening, James said, is due to the omission of an enormous number of facts which filled them originally. So at the individual level, we should concede that our memories are not all that reliable, and thus we can cut ourselves and each other a little more slack. But when healing is really needed, and when justice is truly to be served, memory still matters, as it did in South Africa, and it can matter a great deal. It may require considerable effort and the careful sifting and winning of the gathered evidence, but it can be so much worse to avoid the task of remembering and to continue living with the illusion of a clear conscience. But this is precisely what our country has been doing for decades with respect to race relations. Now, Unitarian Universalists are, generally speaking, a pretty well-informed bunch of people. We know about the horrors of the Middle Passage, during which millions of Africans were transported from Africa to live in perpetual slavery here in America. We know that. We're familiar with the indecencies of slavery. We know how slavery ended. We recognize that Reconstruction soon gave way to Jim Crow with its separate facilities and segregated seating arrangements. We're aware that lynchings took place in the southern and western United States, and that during the Great Migration, African Americans in significant numbers moved into northern cities seeking greater freedom and gainful employment. We know all this. But what may matter more today is what most of us don't remember or were never told. For instance, how many of you knew that a widespread form of slavery persisted in the Deep South almost until the civil rights era of the 1960s? Over 8 decades, and with the active support of government, industry, and some major banks, tens of thousands of African American men were rounded up, arrested on trumped-up or fabricated charges, sentenced to prison, and then sold to mining, lumber, and agricultural interests who literally worked those men into the ground. I did not know any of this until I stumbled upon a book entitled Slavery by Another Name, a carefully researched book by Douglas Blackman. A reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Blackman spent several years unearthing evidence of these very practices from county courthouses and company employment records. Every southern state, he said, enacted an array of interlocking laws essentially intended to criminalize black life. And in 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court simply acquiesced to that arrangement. Although the 14th and 15th Amendments secured voting and legal rights for blacks, protecting those rights, the court said, was a local, not a federal concern, which all but guaranteed that black interests would be ignored in much of this country and that black lives would be exploited. Blackman bristles at the label Jim Crow, which we use to describe race relations during this period of our history. It is, he says, a mild, imprecise term, conveying little of the barbarity of that era. It would be far more accurate, he says, to call this the age of neo-slavery. Only by acknowledging the full extent of slavery's grip on U.S. society, he says, its intimate connections to present-day wealth and power, the depth of its injury to millions of black Americans, the shocking nearness in time of its true end. Only by such acknowledgement can we reconcile the paradoxes of current American life. Here's a second example of repressed memory. I've spent most of my life here in the upper Midwest. But until a few years ago, I had never heard of sundown towns. Indeed, I had been taught that during the Great Migration, Southern blacks headed straight for the big cities, Cleveland, Chicago, East St. Louis, Milwaukee. But that's not entirely accurate. Initially, many African Americans coming north tried to reestablish themselves in Midwestern agricultural communities that felt more familiar to them. And so they opened shops, They worked at various trades. They built homes. Generally, they felt secure in that environment. But then the racial climate here in the North began to shift. Racist films like Birth of a Nation became popular. The Ku Klux Klan stoked the fires of racial resentment throughout the Midwest. President Woodrow Wilson, himself a racist, rolled back all protections for minorities. And so in these small towns, black residents were ultimately driven out. Their property was destroyed or confiscated. Signs were erected at the city limits saying, "No blacks allowed here after sundown." And hence these towns came to be known as sundown towns. And only after these towns were closed to them did many African Americans retreat to the relative safety of the large urban cities. The historian James Lowen pored over the archives of newspapers, county record offices, historical museums, small-town museums throughout the Midwest. He gathered reams and reams of evidence of these exclusionary practices. And although stories about such towns still circulate in the black community, and wary African American travelers will often avoid them even to this day, their sordid history remains all but hidden from those who still reside in those towns. These are memories that matter. And only by gaining a fuller and more honest picture of the past will we ever, as a society, be able to move beyond racial mistrust and racial resentment to a posture of true reconciliation. But for African Americans themselves, this history may matter the most. When Douglas Blackmon's original article on re-enslavement was published in the Wall Street Journal, any number of black readers wrote in to tell him that your article has lifted from us a terrible burden, because his research helped to dispel some of the deep, pervasive doubt that many African Americans harbored about their own worthiness. If not for racial inferiority, they wondered, what explained the inexplicable labored advance of African Americans in U.S. society in that century between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement? What explained it? This explained it. Blackman didn't anticipate the profound reaction that came from his black readers, but it convinced him that history can be a very powerful tool for deeper understanding and for personal healing. But as with our own muddled memories, we all have to work so much harder to get it right. Blessed be, and amen. You will note in our order of service that today's offering is dedicated 100% to the Unitarian Universalist Association and to its plans to advance the interests of black Unitarian Universalists within our denomination. Please be generous.
And you know there were lynchings.
We gather each week as a community of memory and of hope. And to this time and this place, we bring our whole and sometimes our broken selves. We carry with us the joys and sorrows of the recent past, seeking here a place where they might be received and celebrated and shared. We did have one entry in our Cares of the Congregation book that resides right outside the center doors in the Commons. And Anne Smiley simply reminds us to honor and respect our Muslim brothers and sisters as they begin the month of Ramadan this evening. In addition to the one just mentioned, we acknowledge any unarticulated joys or sorrows that remain among us as a community, and we hold them with equal concern in our hearts. Let us sit silently for just a moment or two in the spirit of empathy and of hope. And so by virtue of our brief time together today, may our burdens be lightened and our joys expanded. I invite you to rise once more in body or in spirit as we sing together our closing hymn, number 295. Please be seated for the benediction and the postlude. We close with these words from Elizabeth Tarbox. Summer is an article of faith. Faith in beaches and barbecue and suntan oil. We know that Thanksgiving will come because the calendar says so, that Christmas will never pass unnoticed while the free enterprise system is still in place. But summer cannot be legislated by elected officials, and it cannot be defined by toy manufacturers. And so I pray that your summer will be what you most want from this season. I wish for you warm breezes when you sail, high breakers if you surf, an unlimited supply of number 45 sunblock if you bask, coals that light with one match if you barbecue. I wish for you an occasional hour with a trashy novel, a butterscotch sundae, and an evening without bug bites. And I wish for you love, conversation, and a summer of joy that matches your memories of summer as it should be. Blessed be, and amen.
just as easy as, say, being a child, because Danny's a key on